The Centre for Analytics and Behavioural Change at the University of Cape Town has studied social media campaigns geared to misinform. They say they are again seeing calls for a shutdown and for violence from a sophisticated network of Twitter accounts promoting the ideas of radical economic transformation. The Centre's Stuart Jones joins us now via Zoom. Stuart, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to The Globe.
Thanks so much.
Does this represent the real feelings on the ground?
It's really hard to say until tomorrow, of course. These accounts tend to be reactive. There's a pretty high level of activity from the accounts that we identified. Of the 62 accounts that we identified, only 39 are still active. And of the top 12, only 8 are really tweeting out a lot of rhetoric. They're not at this stage direct calls to violence. And it's likely that if something happens tomorrow, that those accounts will then start doing that. That was the pattern that we saw in the previous round of violence. You know, social media has now come to include WhatsApp, which of course is encrypted and really difficult to get into. And so a lot of the messages that are more targeted and more violent happen on WhatsApp, which means that you're a little blind until something really happens.
Now, Stuart, how can Twitter curb fake accounts? I mean, who bears the honors of curbing these fake accounts? Is it the parent company Twitter? Is it, the intelligence department of the various governments? Who bears the responsibility of ensuring that we clamp down on these fake accounts?
Well, ultimately, Twitter is the only one that can shut accounts down. We regularly report accounts to Twitter, and they are relatively proactive in shutting them down. But bear in mind that they follow American freedom of speech laws, which are a little more libertarian than ours. And so they aren't quite as responsive as we might like to shutting these down. As to what a government can do, again, particularly when it comes to Twitter, a lot of these accounts are anonymized, so it's really difficult to pin them down to a particular person. I think where they do, then the security forces take action. But that's a really tough question, and it takes sustained policy pressure on the social media platforms themselves to get right.
And I suppose it can be a very tedious task for Twitter in particular to curb these fake accounts, because it's very difficult to tell whether a particular account is a fake account, because people can put in fake information or pseudo information with the picture of somebody else. So can Twitter in that particular instance be able to track down this person?
Well, I think it's more important what's being said on the accounts. So anonymized accounts tend to have there could be a set of numbers or a made-up name, and they're clearly anonymized. Then there are fake accounts, which purport to be people that aren't. Those are fairly easy to take down because the person that they purport to be can really report those. There are enough organizations like ourselves around the world that are reporting accounts regularly to Twitter that with some real effort from their side, they could take down fairly speedily.
Now, about the information or the threat of a potential or a possible shutdown tomorrow, can we attribute this behavior to political parties or political actors, as it were, to mobilizing their constituencies?
Well, I think political actors, perhaps. Political parties is probably stretching it. No, this isn't about mobilizing political constituencies. This really has at its heart the radical economic transformation faction or network. And we identified a set of key accounts there that have been operating for most of this year, pushing out material that is effectively anti the rule of law, that supports corrupt politicians, and that rallies their supporters and effectively creates a false narrative on social media. So that when you're coming into social media as an outsider, if you like, or you're coming into this narrative for the first time, you're going to see far more that narrative, that narrative that has been manipulated, than you would otherwise see. And so it's really important from our side to be pushing back against that. We have people that are in there talking back to that narrative. We encourage people that are Twitter users to talk back as well when they see incitement to violence or particularly hateful messaging, and really to help to push back against these accounts that are pushing out this kind of rhetoric.
Are we seeing a surge in political parties resorting to unconventional ways of campaigning as a result of this lockdown?
Well, I guess it has changed the game. You know, we saw a xenophobic network last year that was being supported by some of the smaller political parties. You know, the ANC and the EFF are avowedly anti-xenophobic, and that's sort of opened this political space for smaller political parties to campaign on a xenophobic platform. So we have seen that there. That hasn't really been the case around this violence. It's not that political parties have given their name to any of the rhetoric around this. But undoubtedly, social media has become more and more important as people campaign. And I suppose WhatsApp groups, email, anything non-physical as lockdown has progressed is where political parties have headed. Of course, I'm sure they're all waiting on the decision as to whether to postpone the municipal elections or not. And that'll have a big impact as soon as that is known on the build-up and the campaigning as we go forward.
Yeah, and I see that in this digital era, we see, you know, a massive weaponization of social media. I mean, there's so many people using social media to incite violence, you know, to campaign or to spread whatever message they want to spread. We've seen the Arab Spring, you know, a few years ago, having been started on social media. And we've seen former US President Donald Trump using social media as his best friend to communicate the most sensitive of policy positions of the United States. And some may even argue that he used social media, in particular Twitter, to mobilize people to go into the Capitol and cause violence there. So can social media be used as, you know, can it be said that it can be weaponized to spread whatever agenda that certain people want to spread?
You know, we've been working with this for about 5 years now, and 5 years ago, I really had to make a strong argument to get people to believe me when I said that what happens on social media can have a real impact in the real life, as people call it. But since that Capitol attack and since what we saw last month, I think there's no doubt that there's an increasingly small line between what happens on social media and what happens above the line or in real life. The two impact on each other enormously. What we see in South Africa, what we've uncovered, is a series of organized networks that are working together to divide us, that are deliberately manipulating narratives that are socially divisive in South Africa, and that create false narratives on social media. I think it's important to note that Twitter, while it's fairly small, only about 12% of South Africans are on Twitter, is quite a good early warning system for the kinds of stuff that's going to come up and then sort of move into Facebook and move into WhatsApp groups. And also it has an outsized role to play in media because it's so public. Media often relies on Twitter. So what trends on Twitter often makes it into the newspapers and onto the TV. And if that is being manipulated, that's not genuine public opinion. And the hatred and such that is spewed on social media can be really, really divisive. And then, you know, when it comes to someone like Donald Trump, I mean, he was expressing opinions that he shouldn't, I guess, have expressed on Twitter, but he was also rallying his supporters on Twitter, and he did that unashamedly, for sure. And then there's, of course, targeted Facebook advertising, which also comes into play, which is where you're able to really target people on a micro level with messaging that is deliberately designed to persuade them to change their views, and often to radicalize. What we see is this kind of incremental radicalization of society through these organized networks.
Yeah, and speaking of radicalization of society, we've seen some interest groups, some Islamist groups or jihadist groups in particular. The Islamic State, well, in particular, has been very successful in using social media to spread whatever common goal or whatever a common agenda that they want to spread. Doesn't it make it easier for the parent companies of social media or the tech companies to clamp down on these groups, because they make it very clear that it is them in whatever context that they are pushing whatever agenda that they are pushing and causing harm to the citizenry?
Well, the Islamist groups we've been studying, or I've been studying particularly since 2012, and also Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, ISIS, Al-Shabaab, and now the Taliban has gotten particularly savvy on social media in this recent advance. And so, on one hand, it's a tool to publicize what they are doing; on another, a tool to rally support, and on another, to communicate where otherwise they may not have been able to communicate. But I guess, well, this goes back to Twitter, which is not something that we can solve. Should be monitoring these things. Also, at what point is a group considered a terrorist group? Is that because the United States considers it a terrorist group? These are difficult questions to answer. What we tend to come back to is what is said in individual posts. Is it inciting hatred? Is it inciting violence? Is it violating, our conception of freedom of speech? And if it is, then we believe that those individual posts should be taken down. And if an individual account posts those sorts of posts regularly, then that account should be taken down. And we would then call on Twitter to do that. So I would take it on an individual account basis, although, of course, when you're operating sophisticated networks like we see some of these jihadist groups operate, they're operating thousands of accounts at the same time, so it can be really difficult.
And I suppose we need to strike a balance between political manipulation and digital and disinformation campaigns. We know that former President of the United States, Donald Trump, widely used the term fake news throughout his 4-year tenure. So at what point does fake news become fake news? Because we know that Trump, whenever he was referring to his detractors, in particular media that reports so adversely and negatively towards him, he branded that particular news organization as a fake news organization. And he was very quick to make that assertion that it is a fake news organization. So a person as influential as former President Donald Trump is likely to spread that influence in terms of convincing people that a particular organization is spreading fake news.
Well, the first lie was convincing people that fake news existed as a concept, almost. The moment he called it fake news itself. That was the sort of grandeur of the lie that he told. But yes, it became a weapon. It became a brush to tarnish people with. And that is a very popular tool of demagogues, in that they create a concept and then use it to as a weapon against people. And fake news is an absolutely classic example of that. And it's now gone global, if you like, as a weapon that people are able to use to take out when someone says something that they disagree with. Of course, there is genuine fake news. We've stopped using the term fake news. We really talk more about disinformation and misinformation. So disinformation is deliberately orchestrated spread false information, and misinformation is where people spread disinformation unwittingly, which happens a lot, of course, with COVID-19. In the early days of the pandemic, we saw a lot of that disinformation being created and then being spread relatively innocently by ordinary social media users.
All right, Stuart Jones, lovely chatting to you. Thank you so much for your analysis on this matter.
Thanks so much.
All right, Stuart Jones there is from the Center for Analytics and Behavioral Change at the University of Cape Town, and he studied social media campaigns geared to misinform.